The Collins family had always been defined by two things: money and appearances. My grandmother, Eleanor Collins, built a real estate empire from nothing in the 1960s, when women weren't supposed to have business acumen, let alone outperform their male counterparts. By the time she passed away at 91, Collins Properties owned half the commercial buildings in downtown Oak Ridge and had expanded into 3 neighboring states. I'm Daniel Collins, the family disappointment. While my cousins went to Ivy League schools and pursued careers in finance, law, and corporate development, I became a high school history teacher in a public school. My parents, particularly my father, Richard, viewed my career choice as a personal affront to the Collins legacy, as if I had deliberately selected the profession most likely to embarrass them at country club gatherings. He could have done anything. I once overheard my father lamenting to my uncle at a family Christmas party. Harvard Business School was practically guaranteed with our connections. Instead, he's wasting his potential teaching teenagers about the Civil War for $40,000 a year. What my father never understood was that I hadn't chosen teaching to rebel. I chose it because, unlike the family business, it gave me purpose. Watching a student grasp a complex concept, helping young people find their voice in discussions about the past and its impact on our present. These moments held more value to me than any real estate acquisition ever could. Grandma Eleanor surprisingly seemed to understand this. While the rest of the family treated my career with barely disguised disdain, she would ask thoughtful questions about my students and teaching methods during our monthly lunches. These lunches began when I was in college and continued until just weeks before her death, becoming a cherished constant in my life. "Tell me about your troublemakers," she would say with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Those are always the most interesting ones." When Grandma Eleanor passed away in her sleep on a Tuesday in October, the family's public display of grief was impeccable. My father and his 2 siblings, Aunt Margaret and Uncle James, coordinated a tasteful but lavish funeral. Attended by the city's business elite and political figures, my cousins flew in from various corners of the country, their designer mourning attire and perfectly timed tears painting the picture of a deeply bereaved family. Only I seemed to notice the hasty whispers exchanged between my father and his siblings when they thought no one was watching, or the way my cousin Philip was already eyeing Grandma's art collection during the reception at her mansion. The reading of the will was scheduled for exactly 2 weeks after the funeral. Enough time for the appropriate displays of grief, but not so long that business matters would be unnecessarily delayed. Efficiency, after all, was a Collins family value at least when it came to money. As we gathered in the wood-paneled conference room of Winters & Associates, the law firm that had handled Collins' affairs for 3 generations, I couldn't help but notice the barely concealed smirks being exchanged around the table. Everyone was already mentally spending their inheritance, dividing up properties and assets with the confidence of those who had never questioned their entitlement to wealth they hadn't earned. The Collins family's wealth hadn't simply appeared with Grandma Eleanor, though she had been the one to transform it from comfortable affluence to genuine fortune. The money originated with my great-grandfather, who had the good sense to buy large tracts of farmland on what would eventually become prime real estate as Oak Ridge expanded in the 1920s. My grandfather continued the tradition, developing shopping centers and office buildings throughout the post-war economic boom. But it was Grandma Eleanor who had the vision and tenacity to expand beyond local development. After my grandfather died of a heart attack at 52, leaving her a widow at 45, the prevailing assumption even within the family was that she would sell the business or hand control to her brother-in-law. Instead, she took the reins herself, completed my grandfather's unfinished projects, and then began acquiring distressed properties in neighboring cities during the recession of the early 1970s. By the time I was born in 1991, Collins Properties was a regional powerhouse with a portfolio worth hundreds of millions. Our family name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and the Performing Arts Center downtown. We weren't just wealthy. We were institutional, our identity woven into the city's fabric. Growing up in this environment meant navigating a complex web of privilege, expectation, and scrutiny. My earliest memories include being coached on proper behavior at charity galas, learning which fork to use for each course at business dinners, and understanding that the Collins name was both a blessing and a burden. "People are always watching," my father would remind me. "Make sure they see a Collins." The family dynamics were equally intricate. My father, Richard, was the eldest of Eleanor's 3 children and served as the company's CEO. He had inherited my grandfather's imposing physical presence style, broad-shouldered, with a commanding voice that could charm or intimidate as needed. His leadership style leaned heavily toward the latter, earning him respect in business circles, but creating tension at home. Aunt Margaret, the middle child, handled the company's marketing and public relations. Perpetually polished and camera-ready, she had a gift for crafting narratives that cast Colin's business decisions in the most favorable light possible. Her husband, my Uncle Gregory, was a surgeon who treated his marriage and his connection to the Collins name as another impressive credential on his resume. Uncle James, the youngest, oversaw the legal and financial aspects of Collins' properties. More reserved than his siblings, he had a methodical mind and a talent for anticipating problems before they materialized. His wife, my Aunt Patricia, came from New Tech money and never quite mastered the subtle social codes that governed Collins' interactions, making her something of an outsider even after 25 years of marriage. The cousins formed our own complicated hierarchy. Philip, 35, and Melissa, 33, were Aunt Margaret's children. Philip had his mother's Polish and his father's arrogance, a combination that served him well on Wall Street but made him insufferable at family gatherings. Melissa had leveraged the family name into a career as a lifestyle influencer, turning her privileged upbringing into carefully curated content for her hundreds of thousands of followers. Andrew and Alexandra, both 30, were Uncle James's twins. They had inherited their father's analytical mind and put it to use in corporate law, working for different prestigious firms but specializing in the same areas of mergers and acquisitions. They competed with each other as fiercely at 30 as they had at 13, constantly comparing case outcomes, client lists, and bonus structures. And then there was me, my father's only child, and, in his view, his greatest disappointment. I had the Collins height and the family's characteristic dark hair and blue eyes, but none of the cutthroat ambition that defined my relatives. From an early age, I gravitated toward books rather than balance sheets, fascinated by stories of the past rather than strategies for future acquisitions. Gerald Winters, the family's silver-haired attorney, cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. At 78, he had personally handled Grandma Eleanor's legal affairs for over 40 years and had refused to retire until completing this final duty to her. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying the gravitas earned through decades of managing wealthy clients' most sensitive matters. "As you know, we are gathered to address the last will and testament of Eleanor Victoria Collins." Around the table, family members straightened in their seats. My father's mouth was set in a tight line of anticipation, while Aunt Margaret twirled her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Uncle James maintained his usual stoic expression, though his fingers drummed silently against his thigh beneath the table. Before addressing the specific bequests, Gerald announced, looking up from the document before him, "Eleanor has requested that I read a sealed letter in her own words." He reached for a cream-colored envelope, breaking the wax seal that bore the Collins family crest. She was most explicit that this letter be read in its entirety before any discussion of her estate distribution. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. This wasn't standard procedure, and the Collins family didn't appreciate deviations from expected protocol. My father's frown deepened, while Philip failed to suppress an eye roll that clearly communicated his impatience to get to the numbers. As Gerald unfolded the letter, I noticed a slight tremor in his hands, and something I'd never seen in his professionally neutral expression before, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In Eleanor's own words, he announced and began to read, "To my family, assembled here today, first, let me express my hope that you haven't wasted excessive money on my funeral. I've lived 91 years. Death is hardly a tragedy at this point. And ostentation in mourning has always struck me as vulgar." A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged around the table. The funeral had, in fact, been extremely lavish, with imported flowers, a custom-designed casket, and a reception catered by a celebrity chef, all orchestrated by Aunt Margaret with my father's approval. If Gerald is reading this letter, I have finally done what doctors have been predicting for the last decade and shuffled off this mortal coil. I imagine most of you are anxious to learn how I've divided my considerable assets, so I'll address that matter directly. I haven't. The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of confusion around the table. My father leaned forward, his brow furrowed. To clarify, Gerald continued reading, I have indeed executed a legal will directing the distribution of my estate. But I have not divided my assets in the manner you are likely expecting. Before Gerald explains the specifics, I want to share some observations accumulated over 9 decades of life, particularly regarding wealth and its effects on character. Philip let out an audible sigh, earning a sharp look from Aunt Margaret. The room's atmosphere had shifted from anticipatory to tense, with my relatives' expressions ranging from confusion to growing concern. I built Collins Properties from a modest local company into a regional force through work, strategic thinking, and a willingness to take calculated risks. Along the way, I've observed how wealth affects families over generations. The first generation builds, the second expands, and the third expects. By the fourth generation, entitlement has often replaced ambition entirely. My father's jaw tightened visibly. As the third generation, along with his siblings, the implied criticism wasn't lost on him. Richard, Margaret, James, you have all contributed to maintaining and growing what your father and I started. For that, I am grateful. You have financial acumen and business instincts that have served the company well. What I have found lacking, however, is perspective on wealth's purpose and proper place in a meaningful life. Uncle James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Aunt Margaret's hand froze mid-whirl on her pearl necklace. My father remained rigidly still, though a muscle twitched in his cheek, a telltale sign of suppressed anger I recognized from childhood confrontations. I've watched you raise your children to pursue prestige and financial success above all else, measuring their worth by professional titles and income brackets rather than character or contribution. With one notable exception, all eyes flickered briefly toward me before returning to Gerald, who continued reading without pause. Daniel has chosen a path of service and education, prioritizing impact over income in a way that demonstrates both courage and clarity of purpose, while the rest of the family has viewed his choices with disappointment or condescension. I have observed them with increasing respect. Heat rose to my face as my relatives' gazes returned to me with varying degrees of surprise and resentment. This public endorsement from beyond the grave was as unexpected to me as it clearly was to them. This brings me to the purpose of my letter and the structure of my will. Wealth without wisdom becomes a burden that distorts perspective and diminishes character. I have decided that my estate will not be distributed based on familial entitlement, but on demonstrated understanding of money's proper role in a balanced life. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Philip's expression had morphed from impatience to alarm, while the twins exchanged worried glances. My father's face had gone completely expressionless, his crisis management mode, as I had come to think of it over the years. Therefore, I have established what I'm calling the Collins Purpose Trust. My entire estate, with the exception of a few personal items addressed separately, will be placed in this trust with specific conditions for distribution. The essence of the trust is this, Gerald continued reading from Grandma's letter. Each of you must complete a year of service in a role that contributes to the community while living on a middle-class salary. Upon completion of this year, with quarterly evaluations conducted by the trust administrators, you will become eligible to receive your portion of the estate. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by Melissa's whispered, "Is this a joke?" to no one in particular. Those who choose not to participate will be excluded from inheritance entirely. Those who begin but fail to complete the year in good faith will likewise be excluded. My father finally broke his silence. "Gerald, is this even legal?" His voice was controlled but edged with disbelief. Gerald paused in his reading to respond. "It is indeed legal, Richard. Eleanor worked with myself and 2 other attorneys to ensure the trust meets all requirements for enforceability. If you'll allow me to continue, this structure may seem harsh or even punitive," the letter continued. "It is neither. It is rather my final gift to each of you, an opportunity to step outside the golden cage of privilege and gain perspective that no amount of money can purchase." As Gerald continued explaining the mechanics of the trust, I observed the subtle dynamics unfolding around the table. The initial unified front of outrage was fragmenting as individual family members began calculating their personal stakes and options. Melissa was texting furiously under the table, likely consulting with her lawyer or financial advisor. Andrew and Alexandra had begun whispering to each other, their twin connection allowing for rapid, private communication. Philip stared blankly at the wall, the prospect of leaving his seven-figure Wall Street position clearly rendering him nearly catatonic. "What about Daniel?" Aunt Margaret finally asked, breaking her silence. "Does he have to do anything? Or does teaching already satisfy the requirement?" Gerald nodded, acknowledging the fairness of the question. Eleanor specifically addressed Daniel's situation. While his current profession does align with the Trust's purpose, she felt it would be inequitable to exempt him entirely. Therefore, Daniel must complete a year of service in a different capacity, specifically working directly with underserved populations in a way his current teaching position doesn't. In Compass, all eyes turned to me again, and I felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, Grandma's recognition of my existing choices was validating. On the other, I was now facing the same disruption to my life as everyone else, just in a different form. Additionally, Gerald continued, Eleanor left separate instructions regarding Daniel's role during this transition period. He handed me a smaller envelope with my name written in Grandma's distinctive handwriting. She asked that you read this privately, but it relates to a specific responsibility she hoped you would accept in connection with the Trust. The weight of the unopened letter felt suddenly significant, as if it contained not just paper, but some portion of Grandma. Eleanor's faith in Mia, faith apparently not equally extended to the rest of the family. The resentment directed my way intensified palpably. "So that's it?" my father asked, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "Either we abandon our careers and lives for a year to perform some poverty tourism, or we're disinherited entirely?" Gerald's expression remained impassive. "Those are indeed the terms Eleanor established. Each of you has 90 days to notify the Trust of your decision to participate or decline. Those who choose to participate must begin their service year within 6 months. And what happens to the shares of those who decline?" Uncle James asked, always focused on the financial bottom line. "They will be redistributed among those who successfully complete the requirements, with a portion allocated to charitable foundations selected by Eleanor." This revelation added another layer of complexity to each person's calculation. It wasn't just about securing one's own inheritance anymore. There was potential to increase one's share if others opted out or failed to complete the year. As the formal portion of the meeting concluded, the family fragmented into tense huddles. My father immediately pulled Uncle James aside while Aunt Margaret cornered Gerald with further questions. My cousins gathered near the window, their expressions ranging from disbelief to calculation. I sat alone, turning Grandma's unopened letter in my hands, wondering what additional role she had envisioned for me in this elaborate post-mortem intervention in our family's trajectory. The smirks that had greeted my arrival had vanished entirely, replaced by expressions of shock, anger, and in some cases, a calculating reassessment of their options and of me. I waited until I was alone in my apartment that evening to open Grandma Eleanor's letter. The family had dispersed from the attorney's office in various states of shock and calculation, with minimal direct communication. My father had simply stated, "We'll discuss this as a family once we've consulted with our own legal counsel," before departing with my mother, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, her social training preventing any public display of the dismay evident in her eyes. Now, sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea, a habit I'd picked up from Grandma during our lunches, I carefully broke the seal on the envelope addressed to me in her familiar handwriting. "My dear Daniel," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Gerald has explained the basics of what I'm certain the family is already calling my outrageous scheme, or perhaps something less charitable. I imagine you're feeling ambushed, perhaps even betrayed that I didn't warn you about any of this during our conversations. That was deliberate. I needed everyone, including you, to receive this news simultaneously to prevent any appearance of collusion that might later be used to challenge the Trust. What I'm about to ask of you goes beyond the service requirement that applies to all family members. It's entirely optional, and declining won't affect your eligibility for inheritance. But I hope you'll consider it carefully, as it speaks to what I've observed in you over the years. You have something the rest of the family has lost or perhaps never developed: the ability to see people as they are, not as assets or obstacles in a strategy for advancement. It's what makes you an effective teacher, and what has made our lunches the highlight of my month these past few years. I'm asking you to serve as a family liaison during this transition year. Not as an enforcer or spy for the trustees, they will handle the formal evaluations, but as a resource for family members who may struggle with the profound adjustment I've required of them. Your father, aunts, uncles, and cousins are not bad people, Daniel. They've simply been shaped by privilege in ways that have narrowed their perspectives and, I fear, limited their capacity for genuine fulfillment. Some may approach this year cynically, viewing it merely as an unpleasant requirement to secure their inheritance. Others may genuinely struggle with the loss of identity that comes from stepping away from careers and lifestyles that have defined them. Either way, they could benefit from someone who understands both the family dynamics and the value of the perspective I'm asking them to gain. Someone who can listen without judgment, but also challenge without antagonism when they retreat into old patterns of thinking. I've allocated funds within the trust to compensate you for this role, equivalent to your teaching salary, should you choose to take a leave of absence. Alternatively, you could maintain your teaching position and serve as liaison during non-school hours, with adjusted compensation. Consider this request carefully. Accepting will place you in a delicate position within a family already likely to view you with suspicion, given my public acknowledgement of your choices. Declining is a perfectly reasonable response and carries no penalty. Whatever you decide, know that my respect and affection for you are constants that transcend this arrangement. You found your path without my intervention, which speaks to a strength of character that gives me hope for the Collins' future. With love and confidence, Grandma Eleanor, I set the letter down, overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was asking. The role she described would place me squarely in the crosshairs of family resentment, while simultaneously asking me to serve as their support system through a challenging transition. It seemed designed to be either a recipe for family healing or a path to becoming the permanent scapegoat for everyone's frustration. Before I could process further, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed Alexandra Collins, a surprise, as my cousin rarely contacted me directly outside of obligatory family events. "Daniel," she began without preamble when I answered, "Andrew and I need to meet with you, privately. Are you free tomorrow morning?" The twins' legal minds would already be dissecting every angle of the trust, looking for weaknesses or strategic advantages. "What's this about, Alex?" "Not over the phone," she replied, her voice tense. "Let's just say we're exploring options and could use your ... perspective." Her choice of words echoing. Grandma's letter felt significant. "All right. There's a coffee shop near my school, Bluebird Cafe on Maple Street. 9 o'clock? We'll be there." She paused. "And Daniel? Don't mention this to Uncle Richard or my parents, please." After she hung up, I had barely set down the phone when it buzzed again with a text from Melissa. "We need to talk. Not with the parents. Call me. Within the hour, I had received similar outreach from Philip and, most surprisingly, from Uncle James, who had never sought my input on anything in my adult life. The pattern was clear. Family members were making individual calculations and forming potential alliances, with me suddenly positioned as a swing vote or information source rather than the irrelevant outsider I'd been at family gatherings for years. In that moment, staring at the cascade of messages from relatives who had previously barely acknowledged my existence, I made my decision. I would accept Grandma's offer to serve as family liaison not because I expected to succeed in helping them transform, but because her faith in that possibility was the last gift she had given me, and I couldn't bring myself to reject it. Whatever came next would fundamentally reshape the Collins family dynamic. The smirks had vanished, replaced by calculation, fear, and perhaps, though I hardly dared hope, the first glimmers of genuine self-reflection. The official family meeting my father called took place 3 days later at his Lakeview mansion. The intervening time had been a whirlwind of individual conversations, as various family members sought me out to probe my knowledge of Grandma, Eleanor's intentions, or explore potential service positions that might satisfy the trust requirements while minimizing disruption to their lives. These conversations revealed the spectrum of reactions forming within the family. Philip remained primarily focused on loopholes and challenges, meeting with 3 different trust attorneys to explore legal avenues for contesting the will. Melissa had pivoted to considering how she might transform her required service year into content for her platform. From privilege to purpose, my year of service was her working title. an approach that missed the point of Grandma's intentions, but at least indicated willingness to participate. The twins continued their pragmatic assessment, weighing professional costs against potential financial benefits. Most surprising was Uncle James, who requested a private lunch during which he confessed to a long-suppressed interest in environmental conservation, passion he had abandoned in his 20s to join the family business at my grandfather's insistence. "I used to volunteer with the Coastal Preservation Society in college," he revealed, an aspect of his history I'd never known. "Sometimes I wonder what direction my life might have taken if I'd pursued that instead of law school." By the time the family gathered in my father's formal living room, alliances had shifted and positions had begun to crystallize. My father, predictably, opened with a direct challenge to the trust's validity. "Our attorneys believe we have grounds to contest," he announced, standing before the fireplace in a posture that broadcast authority. "Mother's age alone raises questions about undue influence, and the unusual structure of the trust could be viewed as capricious by the right judge." Aunt Margaret nodded in agreement, while Uncle James remained notably neutral. Among my cousins, only Philip seemed fully aligned with the litigation strategy. "And if we challenge, what happens while the case makes its way through the courts?" Alexandra asked, her legal mind immediately identifying the practical implications. "Collins' properties would be in limbo, potentially for years. Not to mention the public relations aspect," Melissa added. "Challenging Grandma's will would inevitably become public knowledge. Wealthy family. Fights to avoid community service isn't exactly a headline that enhances the Collins brand." My father's expression tightened at this pushback from the younger generation. "The alternative is allowing Eleanor's eccentricity, to derail all of your careers. The financial compensation, while substantial, may not offset the professional damage of a year-long absence that assumes our current careers are the only valid paths," I said, speaking up for the first time. "Maybe Grandma saw possibilities for each of us beyond what we've settled into." "Easy for you to say," Philip countered sharply. "Your teaching job will be waiting after your modified service year. The rest of us are facing career suicide. Or career liberation," Uncle James said quietly, drawing surprised looks from his siblings. "I've been considering participating." This announcement sent a ripple of shock through the room. Uncle James, meticulous, conventional Uncle James, was considering voluntary compliance with Grandma's scheme. My father looked as if he'd been slapped. "James, be reasonable," Aunt Margaret implored. "You're chief legal officer for a company worth billions. What service position could possibly be appropriate for someone at your level?" "I'm exploring options with environmental organizations," he replied with unexpected firmness. "My legal background could be valuable to conservation efforts facing development challenges." As this revelation sank in, the family dynamic shifted visibly. If Uncle James was considering participation, the united front my father had assumed was crumbling before it had fully formed. "I think we need to consider all options," Andrew said, stepping into the silence. "Alexandra and I have been discussing potential legal clinic positions. The professional disruption is significant, but not insurmountable with proper planning." The meeting that my father had intended as a strategy session for contesting the will was rapidly transforming into something entirely different, a forum where family members were beginning, however tentatively, to explore possibilities beyond the narrow paths that had previously defined their worth and identity. I accepted Grandma Eleanor's offer to serve as family liaison the following day, requesting a leave of absence from my school that the principal granted with surprising support. "Taking a year to help your family through a transition? That's exactly the kind of real-world application of interpersonal skills we try to model for our students," she said, making the bureaucratic arrangements far easier than I had anticipated. The trust provided a modest office in a converted Victorian near the City Park neutral territory away from Collins. Properties, headquarters, and family homes. I spent the first week setting up the space to feel welcoming rather than corporate, bringing in comfortable furniture, a small library of books on purpose and meaning that had influenced my own journey, and a coffee station that rivaled the Bluebird Cafe's offerings. Family members began trickling in almost immediately, some openly and others with the furtive air of people afraid of being seen. Melissa was the first to schedule an official appointment, arriving with a notebook full of potential service positions she had researched. The obvious choice would be using my platform to promote charitable causes, she began, but I'm not sure that satisfies the spirit of Grandma's requirements. It feels too adjacent to what I already do. Her self-awareness surprised me. What about positions that would use your communication skills in a different context? I suggested. Organizations that need help telling their stories but can't afford professional marketing. This conversation led Melissa to a small nonprofit supporting teenage girls from low-income backgrounds, where she eventually secured a position developing their outreach materials and mentoring participants. Interested in digital communication, the salary adjustment was dramatic, from mid-six figures to the stipulated middle class income, but, as she confessed during a follow-up meeting, there's something liberating about not having to monetize every aspect of my life and appearance for the first time since college. The twins approached their decision with characteristic analytical thoroughness, creating spreadsheets of options weighted by factors ranging from skill alignment to potential for professional growth. They ultimately chose complementary but distinct paths. Andrew joined a legal aid clinic serving immigrants, while Alexandra took a position with a nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform. We decided working in separate organizations would force us out of our twin dynamic, Alexandra explained. We've been competing and comparing our entire lives. This felt like an opportunity to develop independent professional identities. Philip held out the longest among my cousins, repeatedly scheduling and canceling appointments as he vacillated between participation and refusal. When he finally committed to a meeting, his usual confidence had given way to uncharacteristic vulnerability. Wall Street is all I know, he admitted, pacing the office rather than sitting. I'm good at it, really good. The idea of stepping away for a year terrifies me. What if I lose my edge? What if I discover I'm not as essential as I believed? His questions revealed fears that extended beyond professional identity to core self-worth, suggesting that Grandma Eleanor had accurately assessed the psychological impact of wealth and status on the family. Over several conversations, Philip gradually moved from resistance to cautious exploration, eventually securing a position teaching financial literacy to formerly incarcerated individuals preparing to re-enter the workforce. The third generation presented more complex challenges. Aunt Margaret embraced the trust requirements with unexpected enthusiasm, reconnecting with her early interest in arts education by joining a program that brought visual arts to underserved schools. The transformation in her demeanor became evident within weeks, a softening of her perpetually polished facade, a willingness to appear in public without perfect makeup and designer clothes, a genuine animation when discussing her students' progress. Uncle James approached his environmental position with the same methodical thoroughness he had applied to corporate law, quickly becoming a valued asset to the Coastal Preservation Society he had volunteered with in college. I keep having this strange sense of returning to a path I was meant to follow, he shared during one of our check-ins, like I'd been holding my breath for 30 years without realizing it. My father remained the most resistant, maintaining that the entire arrangement was a misguided attempt to undermine the family's achievements. For weeks, he refused to engage with the process, continuing to pursue legal challenges despite diminishing support from the rest of the family. The turning point came unexpectedly, during a rare weekend when my parents visited my apartment for dinner, under unprecedented development in our relationship. As we sat at my small dining table, so different from the formal settings of their home, my father noticed a framed photograph on my bookshelf. "Is that Mother?" he asked, rising to examine it more closely. The image showed Grandma Eleanor in her 30s, standing before the foundation of what would become the first major Collins commercial development. She was wearing work boots and jeans, her hair tied back, consulting blueprints with a group of construction workers. "She gave it to me a few years ago," I explained. "Said it was taken the day she decided to move forward with the downtown project, despite everyone advising against it." My father studied the photograph with an expression I hadn't seen before, something between nostalgia and revelation. "I remember that day," he said quietly. "I was about 10. She brought me to the site because my father was traveling. She let me wear a hard hat and explained every aspect of the construction process." He fell silent, still looking at the photograph. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual authoritative edge. "She was different, then excited about building something, not just acquiring wealth. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Or maybe I changed how I saw it." This moment of reflection marked a shift in my father's approach. While he never fully embraced Grandma Eleanor's vision, he eventually identified a position with a veterans housing initiative, applying his development expertise to a project that addressed a community need rather than shareholder returns. 6 months into the experiment, the transformation within the family was becoming evident not just in individual choices, but in our collective interactions. Sunday dinners, once formal affairs governed by rigid social protocols, evolved into more genuine exchanges. Conversations expanded beyond business achievements and social positioning to include the challenges and satisfactions of service work, creating connection points that had previously been absent. Not everyone adjusted easily or completely. Philip still struggled with the status adjustment, occasionally reverting to materialistic measures of success during moments of insecurity. My father maintained a certain emotional distance, participating in the process but never fully acknowledging its value. These limitations were to be expected. Deep-seated patterns of thinking and behaving couldn't be completely transformed in a matter of months, but the movement was undeniably in a positive direction, with family members discovering capacities for empathy, adaptability, and purpose that had been dormant or underdeveloped. As Grandma Eleanor had hoped, the experience was providing perspective that no amount of theoretical discussion could have achieved. As the service year approached its final quarter, a new tension emerged within the family. Those who had embraced the experience most fully, Aunt Margaret, Uncle James, the twins, and surprisingly, Melissa, began expressing concerns about returning to their previous lives and roles. What had begun as a mandatory exercise in perspective building had evolved into a genuine reassessment of priorities and purposes. "I'm not sure I want to go back to corporate law," Alexandra confessed during one of our regular check-ins. "The work I'm doing now with justice reform, it matters in a way that negotiating corporate mergers never did." Similar sentiments echoed across the family. Melissa was considering transforming her influencer platform into a channel focused on elevating the voices of the teenage girls she had been mentoring. Uncle James had been offered a permanent position with the Coastal Preservation Society at a significantly reduced salary from his corporate compensation. Even my father, who had maintained a certain emotional distance throughout his service year, admitted to finding unexpected satisfaction in the Veterans Housing Initiative. "These men and women sacrificed for their country only to find themselves without stable housing," he observed during a rare moment of candor. Addressing that injustice feels consequential, in a way that maximizing investor returns doesn't. These evolving perspectives created both opportunity and complication. The opportunity lay in the potential for lasting change in how family members define success and fulfillment. The complication emerged from practical questions about Colin's properties and the family's financial future. If key family members chose not to return to their corporate roles, who would lead the company that had defined Colin's identity for generations? What would happen to the wealth that had shaped our family's position in Oak Ridge society? How would relationships adapt if some members embraced radically different values and lifestyles? These questions came to a head 9 months into the service year. When Gerald Winters requested a family meeting at the trust office, his message was typically concise. Eleanor left additional instructions to be shared at this juncture in the process. All participating family members should attend. The atmosphere in the conference room when we gathered was markedly different from the tense, competitive energy that had characterized the original will reading. Family members greeted each other with genuine interest rather than performative politeness. Conversations flowed naturally, touching on work experiences and personal insights rather than acquisitions and status markers. Even physical presentations had shifted. Designer labels had given way to more practical attire, reflecting both the reduced stipends and the changing priorities of many family members. Aunt Margaret, once never seen without perfect makeup and professionally styled hair, now wore her silver-streaked hair in a simple bob and dressed in comfortable clothing suitable for art classrooms. Gerald arrived carrying a familiar cream-colored envelope with the Collins crest. "Thank you all for your punctuality," he began, seating himself at the head of the table. "As you're aware, Eleanor structured this trust with considerable forethought. Anticipating the evolution that might occur during your service year, he placed the envelope on the table before him. This letter contains her guidance for the final phase of the trust implementation, addressing questions she anticipated would arise as you approach completion of your service requirements." The room fell silent. all attention focused on this final communication from the woman who had so dramatically redirected our family's trajectory. "Before I read Eleanor's words," Gerald continued, "I want to commend each of you on your participation. As one of the trust administrators, I've reviewed your quarterly evaluations. While some adjustments were more challenging than others, his glance toward my father was brief but noticeable. All of you have demonstrated genuine engagement with the experience." Eleanor would have been pleased. This acknowledgement seemed to release some tension in the room. Whatever the letter contained, we had met Grandma's challenge. We had proven ourselves capable of growth, even those who had initially approached the requirement as merely a hoop to jump through. Gerald broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded several pages covered in Grandma Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. "As before, I'll read this in its entirety before we discuss its implications," he explained. As he began reading, I looked around at my family members, once so confident in their smirking anticipation of inheritance, now sitting attentively, their faces reflecting both uncertainty and unexpected hope about what this final message might contain. "My dear family," Gerald read, Eleanor's voice seeming to fill the room through her written words. "If you are hearing this letter, you have nearly completed the year of service I required. Some of you may have approached this requirement reluctantly, viewing it as an unwelcome detour before returning to your real lives. Others may have discovered unexpected fulfillment in your service roles, perhaps even questioning whether you want to return to your previous careers and lifestyles. Both responses are valuable, as they reflect genuine engagement with the experience rather than mere compliance with its requirements. The purpose of this final communication is to address the question that I imagine is now foremost in many of your minds. What happens next?" Gerald turned to the second page, and the family leaned forward collectively, poised between the familiar past and an uncertain future that Grandma Eleanor was about to illuminate. "The question of what happens next extends beyond the mechanics of inheritance," Gerald continued reading. "It speaks to the fundamental purpose of this intervention in our family's trajectory. Was this merely an eccentric old woman's final power play, or something more meaningful? I hope that by now you've glimpsed the deeper intention behind my requirements. This was never about punishing success or wealth. It was about creating space for each of you to evaluate, perhaps for the first time as adults, what truly constitutes a well-lived life. Some of you may have discovered genuine passion and purpose in your service roles, connections to values and communities that resonate more deeply than the pursuit of wealth and status that has defined our family for too long. Others may have confirmed that your previous paths do align with your authentic interests and talents, but perhaps with a more balanced perspective on their place in a fulfilling life. Both discoveries are equally valid. What matters is that they emerge from genuine self-reflection rather than unexamined adherence to family expectations or societal definitions of success." Gerald paused briefly, allowing Eleanor's words to sink in before continuing. "Now, to the practical matters at hand. Each of you who completes the service year will receive your designated portion of the inheritance as originally structured, with no additional conditions or requirements. Those funds are yours to direct as you see fit, whether toward continuing the service work you've begun, returning to previous careers, or charting entirely new paths. However, Collins Properties presents a more complex consideration. As a family business built over generations, it represents not just financial value, but a shared legacy. Its future direction should reflect the evolved values and priorities that I hope this year has helped clarify." The tension in the room intensified. This was the question that had been lurking beneath the surface of many family conversations. What would happen to the company that had defined Collins' identity for so long? "Therefore," Gerald read, "I have established a second phase of the Collins Purpose Trust, specifically regarding the family business. The company shares will be placed in a specially structured trust with the following provisions. First, any family member who completed the service year requirements is eligible to participate in company leadership, regardless of their previous role or lack thereof. Second, participating family members must collaboratively develop a 10-year strategic plan that balances profitable operation with measurable positive impact on the communities where Collins Properties operates. Third, a portion of company profits must be directed toward addressing housing insecurity, environmental sustainability, and educational opportunity, the three areas I believe represent our greatest societal challenges and opportunities for meaningful contribution. My father's expression had shifted from attentive to concerned as these stipulations were outlined. While not explicitly diminishing his authority as CEO, they clearly created a more collaborative leadership structure and directed the company toward purposes beyond pure profit maximization. I recognize, Gerald continued reading, that these provisions represent a significant evolution in how Collins Properties has operated. Some of you may view them as unwelcome constraints on business autonomy. Others may see them as insufficient steps toward more fundamental change. What I hope all of you recognize is the opportunity they present to transform a successful family business into something truly exceptional, an enterprise that generates both financial and social returns, that stands as an example of how wealth can be deployed thoughtfully to address real needs while maintaining economic viability. Gerald. Turn to the final page of Eleanor's letter. My dearest wish is that you approach this next phase not as adversaries with competing visions, but as stewards of a shared legacy with complementary strengths. Richard's business acumen, James's environmental consciousness, Margaret's communication skills, and the varied talents of the fourth generation need not be in opposition. Together, they could form the foundation of a business that honors its past while embracing a more purposeful future. As for Daniel, whose perspective has often been marginalized precisely because it challenged family assumptions, I hope you will continue to value his contribution as a bridge between traditional success metrics and more holistic measures of impact and fulfillment. Whatever you decide, remember that true legacy is measured not in buildings constructed or fortunes amassed, but in lives improved and values transmitted. The Collins name can represent more than wealth and status. It can stand for purpose, integrity, and genuine contribution to the world we briefly inhabit. With enduring love and faith in your capacity for growth, Eleanor Margaret Collins as Gerald folded the letter. The silence in the room felt charged with possibility rather than tension. Eleanor's final communication had accomplished something remarkable, acknowledging the complexity of the choices before us while creating a framework that could potentially accommodate our diverse perspectives and evolving priorities. After a moment, my father spoke, his voice uncharacteristically reflective. Mother always did think several moves ahead, he said, with what might have been grudging admiration. She's created a situation where we must either collaborate or walk away entirely. Is collaboration really so impossible? Aunt Margaret asked. This past year has shown we're capable of more flexibility than I think any of us imagined. Uncle James nodded. The business doesn't have to remain exactly as it's been to honor its history. Evolution isn't betrayal. As the family began tentatively exploring what a transformed Collins Properties might look like, I observed the remarkable shift that had occurred since that first reading when smirks and calculation had dominated the room. Now, there was thoughtful consideration, genuine listening, and an openness to possibilities that would have been dismissed out of hand 9 months earlier. Melissa captured this transformation when she turned to me and said, quietly enough that only those nearby could hear, "Grandma knew exactly what she was doing, didn't she? This was never really about the money at all." I nodded, thinking of all the lunches where Eleanor had listened to my frustrations about family dynamics, her eyes thoughtful as she considered the complex system she had helped create. I think she saw the family she loved becoming increasingly defined by acquisition rather than purpose, I replied. This was her attempt to rebalance the equation before it was too late. The transformation of Collins Properties unfolded gradually over the following year, with both progress and setbacks as family members navigated the complex terrain of collaborative leadership and purposeful business. My father remained CEO but now worked alongside a family council that included Uncle James, Alexandra, and to everyone's surprise, me. My background in education and community engagement, once dismissed as irrelevant to the family business, became valuable as we developed partnerships with local schools and workforce development programs. The company's portfolio evolved to include affordable housing developments alongside its commercial properties, with Uncle James spearheading initiatives to incorporate sustainable design and construction practices. Aunt Margaret redirected her marketing expertise toward communicating the company's evolving mission, finding unexpected fulfillment in crafting authentic narratives rather than polished facades. Not every family member chose to return to Collins Properties. Melissa transformed her influencer platform into a social enterprise supporting young women from disadvantaged backgrounds in developing digital communication skills. Andrew continued with the legal aid clinic, finding his corporate law background invaluable in helping immigrants navigate complex systems. Philip returned to finance, but with a focus on impact investing, leveraging his Wall Street expertise to direct capital toward ventures addressing social and environmental challenges. These diverse paths created a more expansive definition of the Collins legacy, one that acknowledged multiple forms of contribution rather than measuring success by a single standard. Family gatherings evolved accordingly, becoming forums for sharing experiences and insights across different sectors rather than competitions for status and approval. 2 years after the initial will reading, we gathered at Grandma Eleanor's mansion, now converted into the Collins Community Center. Housing programs ranging from adult education to entrepreneurship training for low-income residents. The occasion was the dedication of a memorial garden in her honor, designed to serve as both a peaceful retreat for program participants and a living reminder of her vision. As we stood together in the garden, surrounded by the spring blooms she had always loved, I reflected on the extraordinary journey her sealed letter had initiated. What had begun as a shock, even perceived as punishment by some, had blossomed into something none of us could have anticipated. A family defined by purpose rather than merely wealth, by authentic connection rather than obligation. My father, who had struggled most with the transition, surprised everyone by speaking at the dedication. "My mother was never one for sentimentality," he began, his voice steady but touched with an emotional depth I rarely heard from him. "She preferred action to words, impact to intention. This transformation of her home into a community resource would have pleased her far more than any statue or plaque." He paused, looking around at the family gathered there, so different now from the collection of polished, competitive individuals who had assembled for the will reading. "Eleanor Collins built an empire," he continued, "but her greatest legacy isn't the buildings that bear our name or even the financial resources she accumulated. It's the perspective she finally managed to instill in us that wealth without purpose is merely possession, not true prosperity." 5 years later, I stood in my classroom at the Collins Academy for Community Leadership, a charter school established through the foundation that had grown from Grandma Eleanor's initial trust. My students were presenting projects on local history, including the evolution of downtown buildings once owned solely for profit, now repurposed to serve community needs. On my desk sat a small wooden box that had belonged to Grandma Eleanor. Inside was the letter she had left specifically for me, discovered after her estate was settled. Its final lines had become my personal mantra. "Wealth takes many forms, Daniel. The richest among us are those who recognize which forms truly matter. Thank you for experiencing at the will reading." Everyone smirked until the lawyer opened Grandma's sealed letter. If this story of family transformation and discovering deeper purpose resonated with you, please consider sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment that forced you to reconsider what truly matters? Has an unexpected intervention changed your path in ways you now appreciate? Your story might inspire others facing similar crossroads. Remember, sometimes our greatest growth comes from the challenges we least expect but most need.